In 1939, the Nazi war machine was responsible for one of the most sought-after racing cars of all time. This is the tale of one man's quest.
The dream was the fulfillment of having the car. The nightmare is ending up with no money and no car. I was cheated out of the car by a bunch of crooks, mostly in high places.
Follow an international trail of greed and corruption in Search for the Silver Arrow, Monday the 22nd of April on BBC Two.
Tonight on BBC Two, two programmes mark this week's 250th anniversary of the Battle of Culloden, which brought to an end Britain's last civil war. An extraordinary portrayal of the bloody conflict was held as a masterpiece on its first showing and can be seen again on BBC Two in 50 minutes. First on BBC Two, looking back over the 250 years, drama and documentary shed new light on the Jacobite rebellion.
"250 years ago, the Scottish Highlands were ravaged in the bloody aftermath of Britain's last civil war, a conflict that threatened England and the constitution of the United Kingdom. Throughout Scotland, and especially in the Highlands, thousands of men had left their families to join an armed rebellion, which blighted their lives and their land. The leader of the rebellion was 25-year-old Charles Edward Stuart. Born in Rome to a Polish mother, this prince was descended from the ancient Stuart kings of Scotland, who had also ruled the United Kingdoms of Great Britain. In 1688, James II, the prince's grandfather, was forced into exile because his Catholicism was seen as a threat to the new Protestant establishment. In France, the exiled Stuarts established their court at Saint-Germain, near Paris. They and their supporters became known as Jacobites, from Jacobus, the Latin for James.
Well, the thing you've got to remember about the Jacobite rebellion is it was part of a world game. I mean, Britain was, at the time, the preeminent and growing Protestant power, and it was locked right across the world in conflict with the great Catholic powers of Spain and particularly France. It was a bit like the world being divided in the Cold War period between the West and the Soviet Union. And the way that the French and to some extent the Spanish were trying to use the Jacobites was a bit like the way that the Russians or the Soviets would try and use Che Guevara and the Cubans.
Since 1603, Scotland had been united with England under a single monarch. Though this arrangement apparently allowed the Scots full political independence, there was much dissatisfaction. The Jacobites looked on Scotland as a natural recruiting ground for support. Not only were the Stuart Scots by descent, the warring tradition of the clans offered an army in waiting, as England manoeuvred the troublesome Scots into political union.
In the context of a series of massive wars with France for domination of what effectively became a struggle for world domination, it became insupportable that the Scottish Parliament should act independently in this way and perhaps provide a backdoor invasion force for a French attempt on England.
England put great pressure on Scotland. After 15 weeks of debate, and before candlelight on Thursday, January the 16th, 1707, the Act of Union was at last approved by the Parliament of Scotland. Many Scots felt betrayed.
The impact at the political level was to reduce Scotland's importance enormously. The French, in a very clear-eyed way, they saw it all and said, well, Scotland's been taken over.
Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, attended the debate in Edinburgh as a spy for the English government. On the gathering of a great mob on the Royal Mile below his window, he reported, "A terrible multitude, marching behind a drummer and shouting, 'No union, no union, English dogs.'"
When you have a big partner like that in bed with you, it's very hard to protect your interests. Now, the Union was supposed to protect Scotland's interests. In actual fact, it was really useless.
The Jacobites became a focus for those who opposed the Union, since only they were prepared to use force. Over the next 40 years, they were to make several failed attempts to restore the Stuart dynasty, and, they insisted, Scottish pride. In the Highlands, the return of the Stuarts became part of a people's dreams. Inspiring songs composed by the bards were carried from glen to glen by roving pedlars. The longed-for return of the Stuarts was seen as a second coming, whereby all heartache and all grievances would be removed. The most charismatic figure in Jacobite history, Charles, Edward, Louis, Philip, Casimir, Sylvester, Severino, Maria Stuart, otherwise the Young Pretender, and forever known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, was born in the Palazzo Muti, Rome, in December 1720.
For Jacobites, this was what they'd been waiting for years. Charles's father, the Old Pretender, had long since given up any real hope of regaining the thrones of Britain for himself. And as soon as the prince was born, there were tremendous rejoicings because everyone thought now this boy will grow up to fight the battles which his father should have fought. He'll win back Britain for the Stuart dynasty, and for them the world would have come right again.
News of his birth inspired the Jacobite spirit, and while he was still an infant, the Highland bards were already predicting his future. As he grew into manhood, the prince's desire to win back the British throne became an obsession, but his aging father was anxious about his son's prospects. By his 23rd birthday in 1743, it seemed that the prince was about to realize his dreams. Eager for a second front in her war with England, France was promising soldiers and ships of war. On the night of January the 9th, 1744, Charles left with his father's blessing, and with a commission empowering him to act as regent of Britain when the invasion succeeded. They would never meet again. By mid-February, Charles would reach the Channel coast, where a French fleet was to take him to the Thames, but France called off her invasion plan.
The letdown felt after 1744 was severe in Scotland, but more severe than ever in the mind of Charles Edward, who was appalled at this and determined to go it alone.
The only power in Europe which could help the Jacobites to restore their dynasty was France. And it's important, I think, to grasp that Charles mounts the 45 primarily to manipulate France. So the 45 is an attempt to force the French to reconsider their decision to invade England. And in that sense, what it's meant to do is provoke a large French invasion of the south of England.
The Jacobite couriers who brought news from Scotland to the prince in France were often Highlanders, and among the papers they carried were copies of the songs that foretold his coming. Among the most inspiring of these was the verse of Alistair mac Vaistir Alistair.
Zeg hier dames, week bardoch Alistair week Vaistir Alistair, die bros nog een gloeich. Ach, famous in kein nog, geweldig in chelikig wie dingen van hua. Maar schon habaun van wel woorden ba. Harwa kwanterurt ga Paris is nou die Tsjech. Ba kwanterash ga een schön heel. Ga leinen ooit machier. Er va kusen naar Hochgrieche, naar Hornstelle, naar Vlagrieche.
By 1745, 26 years had passed since the last Jacobite rising. Now again Scotland, particularly the Highlands, was the Stuarts' greatest hope. Rumours of another rising travelled the glens.
Schlis morig al ganji karamoch clan was tarakach nan duol o hididi haichin o hididi an ri hawan tis the mecher madame sarnechi prachna noilian koi.
The stones of the little townships in the glens where the people gathered to hear the songs the packmen brought were scattered long ago. Recently, in the heart of Morven, the remains of a once flourishing community were discovered. These tumbled walls in which trees have rooted are all that is left of the village of Inimore. In 1745, the people here were mostly Camerons. That summer, few could know that the incredible dream was fast becoming an astonishing reality. As if in answer to their songs, the prince came from the sea, a young adventurer without the promised French arms that the clan chiefs saw as vital for success.
The last thing they wanted to hear was that Charles Edward had arrived unaccompanied. They felt a sense of doom and foreboding. Charles astutely then made a virtue out of this necessity. When he landed, he said, "I've come alone, unsupported, without any French help, because I rely on my faithful Highland friends."
And suddenly, Charles is there, blackmailing them emotionally, cheating on all the conditions they'd laid down, obviously trying to start an absolutely crazy venture, almost certain to fail, almost certain to leave them and their families in an appalling situation after he had failed. And you have this terrible tension between their ideology and their sense of honor in a society which is based on shame and honor, and the fact that they're all perfectly intelligent men who can see that this is a crazy business.
The prince knew that the loyalty of some of the greatest chiefs had turned to neutrality. Worse, they might feel obliged to offer their armed services to the government.
Only a minority of the Highland clans actually joined Charles Stuart. Most of the clans north of Inverness, some of the clans in the Eastern Highlands, the Campbells, of course, down in the southwest, would have nothing to do with them. The reason being that they were Presbyterian, they were Protestant, they did not want a return of the Stuarts and all that had involved.
The few hundred who first answered the prince's call were not perhaps the zealots of song and legend. The Highlanders responded to the commands of their chief, and only rarely to sweet persuasion. The ancient clan Cameron would be a great strength in the prince's future army. Here at Inimore, the forceful Jean Cameron gathered her tenants about her and rode with them to the raising of the prince's standard at the head of Loch Shiel, where, 250 years later, history is turned into pageant. The gathering at Glenfinnan began uneasily. It was set for an hour past noon, but by 2 o'clock there was still no sign of the support the prince had been promised. At last, close to 3 o'clock, the Highlanders arrived. Among them 700 Camerons led by their chief, Donald Cameron of Lochiel, enshrined in Highland history as the Gentle Lochiel.
I am Donald Cameron of Lochiel, the 26th chief of the clan Cameron, and I'm in direct descent from Donald Dhu, the 10th chief, and in particular perhaps on this spot from the one known as the Gentle Lochiel, who went out with Prince Charlie.
I ask you now,
If Lochiel, the fervent Jacobite, had kept his clansmen at home, the rising would have collapsed even before it began. The Camerons came because they had to. Highland society at that time was essentially tribal, and the will of the chief dominated their lives. While he offered protection to his tenants, it was his right to summon them to war. All were proud of the blood ties that bound them to the warrior chiefs. Proudest of all was the chief himself.
There is an edge to his willingness to rise, derived from the fact that the economy is in a terrible state. The Highlands are nearly starving in 44, and he himself, I think, is to all intents and purposes bankrupt. And he doesn't agree to go out with Charles unless Charles will guarantee him at least the income he had before he rises, if the rebellion fails. And Charles guarantees that, and it's one of the very few promises Charles ever kept.
Gathering strength as more men were called to the standard, the young adventurer moved southwards, where support for his cause was less certain.
It was seen by the majority of Scots, who by then were Presbyterian, as a Catholic Episcopalian, a coup almost. It's also worth bearing in mind that about a third, maybe quarter to a third of Charles Stuart's army were lowland people, mainly from places like Angus and Aberdeenshire and the Moray Firth, who were mainly Episcopalian.
At Perth, in the foothills of the Highlands, the prince welcomed his most valuable recruit, Lord George Murray, a veteran of 2 Jacobite risings and a genius in the science of war. The Jacobites' advance was virtually unopposed, and without a shot being fired they entered Edinburgh, where they were received with a mixture of jubilation and contempt. The governor of the castle closed its gates and kept them closed, while the Highlanders camped on Arthur's Seat, pricking the night with their fires and welcoming dawn with a thin challenge of their pipes. The first threat to the rising came in mid-September, when a government force of less than 3,000 men under General Sir John Cope reached Prestonpans to the east of Edinburgh. Below Arthur's Seat, Charles assembled his army and, sword in hand, proclaimed, "Gentlemen, I have flung away the scabbard. With God's help I shall make you a free and happy people." They fell upon Cope's army when it least expected them, in the wild charge that was their supreme tactic. Pounding feet and the swing of swords, urged on by the verses of their bards.
Be full bescheurd am voeter gaan, leg looglessen ur laaf, menger kynjes doontje, jarrer ultles muisrug, hier is nog er buie, en toe loske, dan graaf.
After the victory of Prestonpans, Charles probably reached the zenith of his life. Never again would there be the heady intoxication of easy victory, never again the certainty that the crowns were within reach. There were lavish courts and candlelit dancing in the palace of Holyrood House. Despite the celebrations, There were arguments in the Jacobite High Command.
What some of the Jacobites wanted to do was to consolidate in Scotland, to decide that they'd gone far enough, that they could take Scotland and they could build a Stuart Scotland, distinct from Hanoverian England. Charles didn't want to do that. He, strategically, I think he knew that Hanoverian England could never live with a Stuart Scotland.
It's not possible to maintain a supply line of that distance.
Charles knows from the start that he wants the throne of Great Britain. He wants to reconquer his father's kingdoms. Now, in this, he's utterly different from people like Lochiel, who would be happy for him just to hold Scotland. Now, in this case, Charles is right and Lochiel is wrong, because Scotland is the tail that is never going to wag the dog. Scotland could never go its own way in something that England cared about enough to interfere with. Because England has the financial muscle, which translates into military might. The English may not succeed the first time or the second time, but eventually when they can bring all that armed might to bear, splat. That's what happens to Scottish ideas, that we can do our own thing if England doesn't like it.
The prince's will at last prevailed by a majority of 1. In hindsight, there was nowhere for the rebellion to go but southward, across the border in a bold cast of the dice. In London, the government was alarmed by the Jacobites' success and fearful now of a French invasion in support of it. But they were yet to act decisively.
The British government, then as now, not really terribly interested in its home base, was actually very reluctant to withdraw troops from Flanders to deal with the rebellion. The Prince of Wales thought it was a joke, but the Westminster government persistently refused to take the rising seriously and to exert itself by moving troops out of Western Europe.
The Hanoverian King George II, whose family had succeeded to the British throne some 40 years earlier, was eventually forced to return from Germany. He brought with him 6,000 Dutch soldiers, 18 battalions of British infantry and a regiment of cavalry, as well as a promise of mercenaries from the Prince of Hesse. 3 British armies were soon assembling to clutch and contain any Jacobite force that crossed into England. They were commanded by experienced campaigners, George Wade and John Ligonier, and one self-confident young man, King George's 3rd son, William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. In London, hacks and cartoonists fed the citizens' contempt for the army of half-naked savages and for the foppish papists who led them. Every night at Covent Garden, they loudly sang the lines which had been added to the national anthem. On Friday, November the 8th, the Jacobites forded the River Esk and entered England.
Like all civil risings, the 45 is as much a civil war as it is a war between nations, and indeed it probably shouldn't be seen as a war between nations. It's a war in which Scotland, with a very large degree of autonomy, is one of the prime objectives of many of Charles's supporters. On the other hand, it's also disgruntled Brits trying to do something about the Westminster government, and Brits split on this.
As the invaders came south and further south without hindrance, the windy patriotism of the capital slipped into panic.
People think in London that Catholicism is the devil. It's the great Satan. It's the way it treats its women, the way it looks at music, the way it looks at art. Now, in England in the early 18th century, anti-Catholicism is an extremely important business.
The attitude to the Highlander was based on religious opposition, social opposition, intellectual opposition. And there was a sense almost that this was a race almost of Hottentots, of Aborigines, of subhumans, who had to be dealt with in a way you would not handle more civilized nations.
On Wednesday, December the 4th, 26 days after they crossed the Esk into England, and still without a direct challenge from a British force, the Jacobite advance guard entered Derby.
Traumatise up 223, 218 in the spot next to the mark. Please, marshals.
There's terrible panic in London, terrible panic. All these people who had been coining it in on the property boom, on the unit trusts, or their equivalent, all those Anglo-Dutch, get the wind up in a big, big way. And they say, you know, the monster is arriving.
The Jacobites were only 120 miles from London, and nothing stood between the Prince and the capital except a few poorly trained militia. Victory never came so close again.
George Murray, Lord George Murray, brilliant general, had made a daring feint, apparently heading for the mountains of Wales. You see, preying upon his enemies' assumptions. They assumed that the Highlanders, being Highland troops, would move into Wales from the north of England, but they didn't. And Cumberland went lumbering off into the west, leaving the road to London clear. And if they had gone ahead instead of turning back, I think there is very little doubt that London would have fallen.
But the Jacobites were unaware of this. In Derby, the talk was all about retreat.
Charles wanted to march on to London. Murray was saying, look, our lines are extended, we've got winter coming on, supply lines insecure, and most importantly, we're getting absolutely no support from the people of England.
They regard the invasion of England in a very sensible and civilized way. It's a reconnaissance in force to test the waters. They are far too civilized and sensible to impose on England a monarch no Englishman wants, and they are trying to see whether Charles is telling the truth and whether there is enough support in England to restore him on a civilized and stable basis. And by Derby, they've concluded that Charles is a liar and that there isn't that degree of support.
In a moment of farce, the English spy, Dudley Bradstreet, was presented to the Prince.
Cumberland dispatched them up to Derby to say, try and win me some time. Give me 12 hours to get up the road a bit. Bradstreet talked his way through all the Jacobite guards, talked his way into the actual council chamber where the Prince and Murray were having their argument, and told them that a completely fictitious army was pounding up the road from London towards them. And that seems to have tipped the balance of the whole affair.
On December the 6th, Black Friday, the Jacobites turned their faces northward. For the first time, the Prince did not start the day on foot and at the head of the column. He rode behind on a black horse in black despair. There were scarcely 5,000 men with him now, and 30,000 or more moving to stop him.
The Prince seems to have known it was the end from the moment he started to march back from Derby. He was not a particularly good tactician on the battlefield, but he was a good strategist in terms of the overall campaign. He understood that there could be no Fortress Scotland.
The Jacobite army forded the Esk again on December the 20th, the Prince's 25th birthday. Some of the clansmen flung off their plaids and danced warmth into their bodies, if not into their hearts.
Uyel edem hamadongin, dru harich met soos, le mishnit vos le parentus orniaraik hukamich oin. Lerún nach tjúnda sin cool, rar fiú haman coprach, ó tucamit le heide chrún, Sá nún oes gevelga.
For 5 weeks, the Jacobite army camped on the Stirling Plain. For part of this time, the prince lived in great state in Glasgow. He was encouraged by success against the pursuing government army at Falkirk, but the chiefs warned him that sickness and desertion made a retreat into the Highlands imperative. The wish was in all men's hearts, home to the hills, and there wait for spring. The prince came here to Culloden House in the 3rd week of February 1746, having entered the neighbouring town of Inverness some days before. His army was sadly worn and reduced by the long march from the Stirling Plain. Of the 5,000 men he had taken to Derby, many were away home to their glens. Others were sick or exhausted. The Highlanders had come through the mountains, dragging carts of supplies through deep snowdrifts, fierce snowstorms freezing the breath in their throats. This is Culloden Moor, at the centre of Drumossie Moor. Drumossie, the stinking ridge. A long hog's back between the Murray Firth and the green trough of Strathnairn, it is perhaps the most emotive spot in all Scotland. The Hanoverian army under the Duke of Cumberland had followed the Jacobites northward throughout the winter, never fully engaging, always threatening. Now it was encamped outside the town of Nairn, 15 miles to the east of Drumossie. It was well equipped and harshly disciplined, and a large part of it was composed of veterans from the European War. 10,000 men now moved westwards towards Culloden. Among them were 4 Scots battalions spoiling for a fight. At breakfast time on the 16th of April, over 1,000 men were still asleep in the grounds of Culloden House below the moor. They were exhausted by a bungled attempt to surprise Cumberland's camp during the night. Some were bitter, some confused, and some were angry. They were also hungry. A cruel northeasterly wind was blowing as Cumberland's men advanced. Watching from across the sodden moor, 4,000 Jacobites stood shivering in their plaids against the wind. In the next 40 minutes, the lives of every one of them will be touched and changed forever. Between 12:30 and 1 o'clock, the battle began. First, a cannonade from the Jacobites, answered immediately by the rolling thunder of the Royal Artillery, and cutting swathes in their lines. Provoked beyond endurance by artillery fire, the clans at last surged forward against cannon and musketry, falling first upon the left flank of the British. They broke the redcoat line on the left, but it was closed against them, and the tartan tide fell back in a stumbling run. In the 40 minutes that had passed since the first gun fired, upwards of 1,500 Highlanders, almost half the Jacobite army, lay dead and dying on the field, the victims of the prince's ambition and the overwhelming superiority of the government's military machine. As the cries of the wounded filled the air, now clearing with the smoke of battle, the redcoat lines moved forward to take possession of the Jacobites' ground.
Chachrois chacharchem hagam chragach mochele Omagacum immaner conscienzum domach lenye
After victory, revenge. Blood was a word much used in dispatch and report. Its shedding needed for the extirpation of all rebellion. Cumberland justified himself in proud letters to London. All the good that we have done is a little bloodletting. If we had destroyed every one of them, such is the very nature of the soil here, that rebellion would sprout out again, if a new system of government is not found in this country. Cumberland wrote, "I thank God that I was an instrument in the affair. I really believe that a month or 6 weeks will enable me to do all the things that would be necessary."
No! 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 Don't! No!
Influential men in England, still alarmed by the earlier successes of the rebellion, urged Cumberland on to his punitive duty. The cultivated wit, Lord Chesterfield, declaimed, "Starve Scotland, put a price on the heads of their chiefs, and let the Duke put all to the fire and sword."
This is what the 18th century state does when it gets a troublesome ethnic minority. They go in, they burn, they kill, they race people's houses. Now, it's not genocide. It's not, we racially hate these people and we're going to stamp them out. It's not Rwanda. It's not Hitler. But it is nasty, violent, coercive force. You guys are the nail sticking out. We shall hammer it in. You do as you're told, or we will do what we like to you. No wonder this lives in Highland oral tradition, even now.
I think that the intention was genocidal and it verged on ethnic cleansing. Cumberland and indeed the British government were intent on a final solution to the Highland problem. One solution was to whole-scale evict the clans, uproot them, transport them off to the plantations. This was actively considered, was deemed too expensive. So we went for a more cost-cutting exercise of taking rigorous reprisals. But these reprisals were done indiscriminately against Highland areas. There was also a deliberate policy of starvation. Now, if you're going to remove a people, you don't have to slaughter them all, but you can starve them out.
All Scotland was now under military occupation, and though some prominent Hanoverians called for mercy and victory, attacks on Highlanders and their townships were savage and indiscriminate. Even supporters of the government were victimised. The people, wrote an officer, are deservedly in a most deplorable way and must perish either by sword or famine.
The 45 had come too close to success, so there was a determination on the part of the London government that the whole system of clanship would have to be removed.
Thus the work of musket and bayonet, of hangman's rope and cleansing torch continued. Cumberland, when asked to have regard for the country's laws, shouted a bold answer. Laws? I'll make a brigade give the laws. Avoiding the scorched earth policy his rebellion had provoked, Charles Edward was now skulking in the west, protected at mortal risk by men and women of all classes. After defeat, he had to endure the humiliation of the fugitive, and once dressed as Flora MacDonald's maid to elude government spies.
King George in London had recognised within 2 months of Culloden, the euphoria subsiding, that Charles would be a terrible embarrassment if he was caught. He must be allowed to escape. And so the hunt was scaled down. The ships of the Royal Navy were withdrawn from the West Coast. The West Coast was left clear for the final of the 6 rescue attempts from France to get through.
5 months after the disaster of Culloden, the Prince said a last farewell to his faithful supporters and sailed for France with the gentle Lochiel. Cumberland returned to London in mid-July to a riotous welcome, a Thanksgiving service in St. Paul's, and a special choral work written by Handel. See, the conquering hero comes. Under Cumberland's successors in command, the harrying of the glens continued through a bitter winter to a second year, and on for a decade or more. Among the victors there was a fear that unless this warlike race of Gaelic speakers was utterly broken, France would still use it as an invasive ally. The carrying of arms was forbidden on pain of death or shipment to the colonies. The wearing of the Highlanders' customary dress of kilt and plaid was also forbidden. Gaelic, the language of the Highlanders, was further targeted, and steps continued to silence a barbarous tongue now associated with sedition. When the English sage Samuel Johnson visited the Highlands in 1773, he recorded sadly, "Their language is attacked on every side. Schools are erected in which English only is taught, and there were lately some who thought it reasonable to refuse them a version of the Holy Scriptures, that they might have no monument to their mother tongue."
Bunöver gan y grwy'n heiltiol a hachyd y leib chlote, ac nach rwy'n y gael eis na Salsmich, ioloch et canan eis cultur mingeir. Bad cwap et na gael man thyn y porope fyrglwach.
Aye, over your right.
Go! Go, rear right!
Marco Roy, go over your right. Stand still, over your left and touch the wrong mind.
The energies and proud traditions of Scottish Highlanders were not wasted, and Britain soon exploited the martial heritage of Highland society.
Right.
Hai go al du, Sheach gan bigad gang hwyr, gang Iwlan cho ffader falaf, fan y geeltoch, sy gos, go America, go India, gan y rhain York, achos yn fi ach yr geeltoch ein. Agos cwdioch, gan ieich a marach y blar cachau. Chan i'r chygys yn mi ag ein vision, has grif le Priaf ar Pitt, le General Wolfe, no great mischief 54.
What the 45 and the aftermath did was result in the final pacification, the final stability of Highland society, which allowed chiefs increasingly to become landowners, commercial landowners, and to regard their lands as assets, rather than simply, as had been mainly the case before, as sources of military power.
As the chiefs abandoned their Highlanders for southern ways and advancement, they also discarded their role as father of the clan. Before the end of the 18th century, there were new, more profitable incomes to be had. In the straths and glens which had once resounded with the calls of children and the chant of Gaelic song, a new sound was heard. Sheep were profitable. The people were a burden and had to make way for the chief's four-footed clansmen. The roofs of their cottages were burnt, the stones scattered, and the people driven away by sheriff's officers to make their own way to the south or to the colonies on the aptly named coffin ships. In 4 generations, hundreds of thousands of Highlanders were forced from their land, an episode burnt into Highland memory as the clearances. 79 years after Jean Cameron led her tenants to Glenfinnan, the township of Innymore had a population of about 100. One woman, Mary Cameron, left her story for coming generations.
Hannig clána himidich an y mydd na cosh. Agus few yn haiche na badje charod I uth in jegasgach tehe. Begin falla. Amach I gorst ag I gŵd y hwgyn hanas yn y ddyfar gafafyd. Lent mis y Seamus yn ddyniagam. Da I ad bec na nai yn eith mo chich. Agus dws yn ach maddol na gŵl y cosioch ddim o hyf.
I don't like the word clearances for a start. It was an exodus. There were many, many reasons for people leaving these shores. And the main reason was overpopulation and great opportunity in the New World. And I've met a lot of people from Canada and from America, and none of them have any regrets whatsoever. And I've been to the New World many, many times, and they're very proud of their heritage, but they are happy in their New World.
Shalaf man koos jufes fechtjef na huaslein, kun country truagan kun stuat gesri taivich. San haat een barrel nach puntjef dan tallen. Sket gaket je vallen, ga neket maar haule. Gailiet en shallig, het gachrug, agus gjallig, va eterne verf, hukum ferran onaivich.
The deep wound of Culloden and its aftermath still bleeds today in empty glens and distant islands where the relics of a Gaelic society survive. The battle was the end of a civil war and the end of conflict with England. It settled a now pointless dispute over the crown, but it merely postponed the proper consideration of Scotland's union with England, sealed by the military slaughter and ritual persecution of the Gaelic people.
Fáilte Shemian is glucht
A dramatic reconstruction of the Battle of Culloden is coming next on BBC Two.
On March the 4th, 1933, a man who couldn't walk began to lead a crippled country.
It's just unthinkable that a person in a wheelchair could be elected president of the United States.
A man of privilege who became a champion of the people.
The entire country decided he was the savior.
Who overcame personal tragedy to guide a nation through two of the most difficult periods in its history.
He was leading the free world against Adolf Hitler, and it wasn't at all clear that we were going to win.
In a 4-part documentary, BBC Two tells the story of America's most remarkable president.
Everybody loved.
FDR begins Saturday at 8:05 on BBC Two.
The story of British art is the biography of the nation itself, linking our religion, literature, science, philosophy and politics. It's a story of repression and revolution, of forgotten masterpieces, once censored, now neglected, even worse, ignored. It's a story of soap opera and satire, of animal magnetism, and of how modern art was first invented, not in Paris or New York, but right here in Britain. Most of all, it's a story that simply drives the British crazy.
Andrew Graham Dixon ventures into the first television overview of the history of British art, next Sunday at 7:30 on BBC Two.
Now on BBC Two, showing for the first time in over 30 years, Peter Watkins' acclaimed film recreates the brutal events at Culloden.